All right, welcome back. So, the title of this mini lecture is The Spanish Conquest of the Americas. And we're going to talk about 5 terms that you need to know as you go to do your reading and learn more about this particular topic. The hope is that these terms will help you to be able to understand it a bit more effectively. All right, so before we get into these 5 terms, I want to tell you a story. So, when I was in grade school, we did a project where we had to pick a historical figure. We had to, go to the library and get an encyclopedia. That's dating myself, I know. And we read up about our figure, and we had to dress up as them and come in and give a speech for a minute or two. And I picked Juan Ponce de Leon, the Conquistador, because, that makes a lot of sense. I had a hat that had a feather in it, so obviously that meant conquistador. Now, at the time, I was told that conquistadors were these great guys, that they were really positive individuals who were kind of on the cutting edge of technology and exploration at the time, sort of like the tech entrepreneurs of the early 21st century. That Juan Ponce de Leon and his buddies are, kind of like, Elon Musk or Zuckerberg or, really anybody you can name in the 21st century. Now, eventually I got older and read these things called books and realized, oh no, that's really racist and wrong. But I was 10, and, you tend to believe a lot of what adults tell you when you're 10. So, that being said, 5 things that it's important for us to know when it comes to the Spanish conquest. 1, Christopher Columbus. All right, so Columbus begins his journey thinking he's going to make it to India in 1492. Of course, he makes it to the Americas. A couple of things to know: the world did not really think that the world was flat at that time; that you would literally be flat and fall off the end of the world. That's a myth. He has multiple expeditions. When he comes back on the second expedition, one of his ships, which had been turned into a fort, was burned and the men were killed. And so there was this feeling that the Spanish could commit a just war against the indigenous people, and they do. So this is a violent conquest. Second, encomendero. Now this comes from encomienda. And again, I apologize for my Spanish pronunciation. I do mean well. Basically, this was an individual who would be given a grant of the right to control the labor of individuals. So the area that you would have, the land you'd be given, you'd have the right to control the labor of these individuals. So this wasn't really a titled noble, but it was kind of close to it in New Spain in the 16th century. And getting noble title was a really big part of life in Europe in the 16th century. And so this was something that individuals lusted for. They really wanted it. They wanted to pass it down to their kids. They wanted to be known as these kinds of individuals. Third, disease. We don't do enough to understand the effects of things like climate change, certainly in the 21st century, but also the things like the effect of disease and change and environmental impact and change and ecological change in the 16th century. And scholars more recently, in the last 30, 40 years, have written extensively on how these first interactions between the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English and the French and others who from Europe who come to the Americas, how devastating the diseases that came with them were on the indigenous peoples of, across the Americas. Millions would eventually die. Smallpox certainly is a terrible killer. Syphilis was another. So there's a lot, for us to understand there, but the figures are devastating. It's something like 25 million people lived in the what we might call Latin America or Central South America today, and about 2.5 million of them were alive after about the first 100 years of contact. All right. Fourth, Battle of Cajamarca. So again, continuing this element of violence within that first generation of conquest, You have a series of battles that are going to take place amongst some in order to establish control in these indigenous communities. And so in 1532, Francisco Pizarro and his forces are going to fight this battle in what will become modern Peru. And it will take them a few decades after that to eventually establish colonial Peru. But it is after that first very successful battle that it became clear that they were going to be successful. So again, Battle of Cajamarca, 1532. All right, number 5, Columbian Exchange. All right, now this was a term that comes to us from an historian. His name was Alfred Crosby, and he wrote about the exchange of really anything that came from the Americas back between Europe and really kind of starting this creation of an Atlantic world. So diseases coming from Europe, diseases coming from the Americas to Europe, the role of food being exchanged, right? The potato doesn't originally come from Ireland, right? Sort of those kinds of things. Or the tomato from Italy, right? This idea. So there's positives, but also there are profound negatives, and the amount of death that we're talking about when it comes to things like the Columbian Exchange needs to be acknowledged and needs to be understood as a part of the lived experience of life within this period of really brutal conquest. Thank you.